Started my first startup in '97. The world told me I was insane.
Our goal is creating future economies that are more regenerative and sustainable.
Something didn't match up. Why hasn't this become the next big thing? And that's where we invested.
The whole purpose of achieving anything in life is measurement.
Without further ado, it is my distinct honor to introduce Chante Harris, who is Director of Climate Investment and Partnerships at Second Muse. Chante currently leads climate investment and partnerships for venture and climate tech at Second Muse, sourcing the best climate tech solutions across the globe. Named by ACEE as a champion for energy efficiency, America on Tech as an innovator and disruptor in tech policy, and Women Enews as pioneering woman in sustainability, Chante is at the helm of driving urban innovation, building sustainable cities, advancing cross-sector collaboration, and tapping into communities to launch better solutions and technologies. She's worked to scale nationwide campaigns, technologies, and ideas for the Obama administration, Fortune 500 companies, and startup companies. Chante is also a venture partner with Republic and NextGen. It's my pleasure to introduce Chante Harris and KP Reddy. With that, KP, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Ian. Hope everybody's having a great day. It's now 6 o'clock. If you've been with us since 10, we may or may not have given you a lunch break, but hopefully you ate something. And like I said in my morning kickoff, stay hydrated. It's a good thing. So, Chante, so thrilled to have you on. We met in I would say my first in-person event here in Atlanta, and we met, we had a brief Twitter chat afterwards. And so I was really excited that you were available to talk to us. And I think I mentioned to you, we don't really have a lot of other VCs. We're pretty good about closing the door on other VCs at our conference, but I thought you had a very interesting story and point of view. And you got me at MEP. Like when you said HVAC and MEP needs innovation, I was like, hey, who's saying that? So you got me there. But I'd love to start off Ian went through your background. Can you kind of hit the highlights a little bit of your journey? Because I just think it gives great context to kind of where you're currently at and where you're going.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for having me, KP. And yeah, I know you mentioned you don't typically invite folks like myself up here. So it's an honor to be here. And of course, I said yes, because I think similar to you, I really appreciated your points when we shared that stage. That was also my first in-person event in quite some time. So it was definitely interesting to be in person with folks. In terms of my background, I've really spent the past several years working across sectors. I never really expected to be deploying capital or, working one-on-one with founders who are building various innovations and technologies. Fell into the climate space as well. A lot of my background started out in DC, kind of doing every political wonky thing you could think of, launching national issue-based campaigns, fundraising, all of the stuff that you think of. So I won't dive fully into it. But I left DC really with this desire to kind of see things implemented more on the ground, and just knew I was always a problem solver and liked to see solutions really being deployed in real time. And so that brought me to New York. I think, I thought to myself, what's one of the hardest markets to think about solutions for? And New York was sort of top of the list. I'm also an East Coast girl, grew up in New Jersey, born and raised there. And so I came to New York, actually worked across sectors through a fellowship program that I participated in. And I knew I always had this interest at the intersection of business and government, but I didn't realize how much it was going to align throughout my career trajectory. So I left that fellowship program and, just kind of wanted to challenge myself. I had been in government and policy and I knew that there was value there, but also never really liked the idea of siloing how we solve problems across sectors. And so I was recruited in my last role, which I ended up being at for almost 4.5-5 years, to start our first climate and innovation practice. And when I joined, I didn't really have much insight into what was happening on the technology and innovation front. But what I did see was a gap in the market And I'm sure many of the people who are tuning in now are probably familiar with the fact that, oftentimes government policies and goals will have these big lofty statements and even funding behind them, but they don't actually oftentimes identify the specific solutions that will get us there. And so one of my team members and I basically sat down and went through what are the sectors that are emerging in a place like New York, but really cities across the country that we can start to not only explore solutions for, but convince folks who have already done this work in other markets to come and actually be a part of solving that problem. And so we dove into mobility, we dove into infrastructure, the built environment, waste, ag, and food, and essentially started recruiting global companies to come to New York and the US market, and supporting them not only on kind of the policy front and tapping into funding, but then really over time it evolved into go-to-market strategies, so helping them identify pilot projects, demonstrations, procurement opportunities. Many of New York City and New York State's procurement opportunities can be not only difficult to navigate, but also have an amazing return once you get on that list and you're actually, deploying whatever solution you offer. And then, I recognize that there's a bit of a disconnect between some of the startups that we started to bring on board. I think around that time, we saw a lot of urban tech, climate tech, incubators, accelerators popping up and growing. And many of the companies were coming out of those programs and still not really understanding how to get to market and what was needed for that. And so that really intrigued me because I just thought to myself, one, hey, there seems to be a real need here. But then also, what does that mean for the investment side of things when we're talking about some more capital intensive technologies that oftentimes take longer to get to market, but also require, I think, a very specific type of expertise to scale. And so, I started talking to a lot of folks on the investment side. Over some time, actually started exploring a financial mechanism on my own. And that's when Second Muse heard about some of the work I was doing. And, I was tapped to essentially join the team. And so now, I won't go into the specifics unless you want me to, but joined to run our climate tech venture studio, which really aims to de-risk the earliest stages of climate tech. And we do tend to focus on some of these more areas that focus on the built environment. So infrastructure, mobility, waste, for example, just a lot of different technologies and solutions that are being deployed in cities and urban environments.
Got it. And, so I think, we all say like climate tech, there's been a few cycles of investing for venture, and some of us have lost a lot of money over the last 20 something years. And the pattern that emerges is policy. This is a startup guy saying this, right? Policy is set by the big guys with big checkbooks and lobbyists and all that. And as a startup, you don't really get to own your future because some of the big guys are owning the future. And hopefully you can find a little graft behind them and maybe get big enough. But, I think that's one of those challenges around anything that's kind of policy driven. You have to kind of wait for it to be approved. But unfortunately, there's a whole group of people that maybe were in the room, right? And it's really hard for a startup. And I think for us, we've always said, we think our unfair advantage is around the markets and technology and all that. I don't believe we have an unfair advantage around understanding how policy works, quite honestly. Yeah. That's just not our roots are kind of gritty entrepreneurs, not, let's go study 100 pages of policy and understand what's going on. That's never been our background. So do you feel like that's part of the edge you're providing in your venture studio? Is this kind of digging deep into the policy aspect and possibly even influence around policy, or is it more navigating policy that other people have drafted?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think we did our summit, as you know, last week, and I had Jigar Shah on for a fireside chat. And so we got to talk a little bit about this. I think what differs at this moment for climate tech that we didn't see for clean tech. And I recently learned about, environmental tech in the 80s, which I didn't know about. And, Jigar was saying this, but also a few other folks who've been in the space longer than I have been echoing this, that, in order for solutions to work and scale, there has to be a market. And I think for the first time ever, what we're seeing is there's there's a market that's ready to actually deploy these technologies. There's incentives not only on the business side, but also the consumer side as it relates to demands and what people are looking for around how they spend their dollar. And then there's also a sense of urgency that we haven't quite seen before, in large part because, we're already seeing the ramifications of the climate crisis. I mean, New York obviously experienced Hurricane Ida previously, and it's very hard to ignore the impact that it had, right, on infrastructure. I'm sure people saw the videos of folks, essentially underwater, right, in a place like New York City. And so it's happening in real time. And the reality is that there's an incentive not only on the government side, but I think also on the business side for many reasons to actually move the needle on these solutions. I think when I think about our differentiator, so myself and Jackie Amable-Ross is the MD for Venture for Climate Tech. And, she was one of the first Latinas to raise millions of dollars for a hardware startup. So she really has that experience coming from a founder and being able to say, hey, this is what I experienced. This is what I saw in building, anything related to hardware. And this is how I scaled it and told the story. Whereas I come from, an operator background, really scaling companies, but also really understanding how corporates moved. I was working with some of the largest fleet manufacturers in the world for electric vehicles, some of the leading hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicle companies. And I think that insight utilized alongside policy and understanding of what drives policy, not so much policy itself. I think policy is important, but I think understanding what moves policy is actually what's more key here. And I say that because I was, for example, talking to a startup this past week, and then I also had this conversation again with Jigger, and they were essentially saying, hey, the way that the policy is being written around carbon technology does not actually include our real-time solution that can go to market and have an impact for thousands of, fleet manufacturers and electric vehicles on the road. And the reality is they don't have the team, but also to your point, the funding and the ability to really spend a lot of time in Washington actually influencing policy or influencing the language in this bill. But what they do have is the ability to work alongside a coalition and to talk to these coalitions that are already driving this policy, or to find a corporate that is having similar conversations and maybe working on a big project. And I specifically say that as an example because there is a specific corporate where they are manufacturing their technology that is huge, that is big, that has a policy team. And so, what I've essentially been advising them on is going to that corporate, building that relationship, because there's not only an application as a customer, but they're also able to say, hey, well, if we're going to work with this company, it only makes sense for us to actually in real time also talk about the solution that we're going to partner with. So I think it's really an understanding of how to drive and push the right stakeholders and certainly push the right policy influencers so that you can, as a startup, see a market that is more friendly, right, and allows you to actually scale your technology.
Yeah, I think if one of our startups came to us and said, use of proceeds, we want to see engineers and salespeople, that's all we want to see, right? And they said, oh, by the way, I'm going to hire 3 people for policy. They get a really nasty look from us, probably. Right. It's we want you to either write code or get customers. I don't know about all this other stuff, right? But that I think that's super helpful. I think, one of the things that we've seen, especially in New York, where I think there's been a shift of thinking around owners, and maybe you've seen it too, whereas policy comes out and their first thing is well, how do we get around it? And is it worth just getting fined or actually comply? Right. They do this risk exercise with lawyers and accountants. And I'm seeing a different trend that says, you know what, that makes sense. That makes sense. And I think we should do it because it's the right thing to do and it'll save us money. And in many ways, in New York with some of the policy there is that, everybody has to do it. So, it's kind of normalizes the costs because everyone has to do it. Now, if you're a small owner, maybe it's harder. If you're RXR or related group, you have people to go dealing with these policies. And maybe if you own 2 buildings in Manhattan, it's a little bit more of a challenge to comply. But I've just seen a softening of owners and really seeing this as an opportunity to kind of do the right thing versus avoid doing the right thing. And maybe I'm just like an optimist. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen both, to be honest. I think, I don't want to create this dream that everyone's like, oh yeah, there's great mandates out there and now we're all going to adhere to them. But I think what's interesting is, I actually worked in my previous role with a startup that was essentially helping developers, to sort of the big real estate folks that you would imagine in New York, think through an alternative model to the framework for a mandate that was being introduced. And I think that's interesting because it's less of, hey, look at the policies that are coming out, drive and influence them to be in favor of your technology. But I think more so be a part of the conversation around what is possible. Because when I think about our founders, there's so many things that they're building that most industry folks would say, well, that's not going to happen, right? Like either we're not going to adopt it, or there's just, not a friendly environment here, or there are regulatory hurdles that, we can't even imagine that. But I think that's kind of the beauty of tech, right? And the beauty of innovation is that, if every founder woke up listening to the amount of time someone said, hey, that's not going to happen, I think especially on, the government side of things, they wouldn't do anything in the space. And so I think what I saw during my time really scaling these startups, but also getting them to work with corporates, was that there was an interesting sort of tie or opportunity in between those conversations to actually say, hey, well, in this regard, this is what we'd love to see on the policy front. On the flip side, though, if you're a huge industry group or a huge player in this specific sector, you also have the ability to say, actually, maybe this mandate can be a part of that, but there's also this really kind of new innovation or technology that's coming out that we feel like will actually allow us to have a greater impact and start to meet some of the, whether it's the demands or the requirements that many, elected officials or government entities want to see. And that was really interesting because it was kind of opening a door to say, there's actually more we can be doing here. And here are some ideas around that. And here's an actual solution being built, right, on the tech front that will help us get there. And the reality is, like, industry is still driving, right, a lot of this conversation. And so I think with my founders, we think a lot about, you're not hiring 3 policy folks. No, you don't have the runway for that, nor does that necessarily make sense. But maybe you have an advisor, right, who used to work at an agency or who used to specifically help on large infrastructure projects and understands the permitting and licensing process and can sort of tell you, hey, here's language that you can use to approach these stakeholders to help you scale faster. I think what I was seeing was a lot of just like disrupt the market, throw it in and hope it works. And then oftentimes it was, well, actually now you're halted from operations for 6 months because you've pissed off the DOT and, they're not really willing to come to the table anymore. And I guess what I'm arguing for is not so much a either or, right? But like, how do we actually have more conversations around the gray area in between? And so, yeah, I think that's a lot of what we think about. And we're so early stage that it makes sense because I can kind of not always foreshadow, but say, hey, this is something you should be thinking about earlier on as a founder. And we're already seeing some really great implications from that.
That's great. Remind me your venture stage. So what kind of start, like stage, and climate tech can be like a big bucket, right? So it means a lot of things to a lot of people, everything from, alternative proteins to, concrete and decarbonization, right? It's a pretty big, it's a very large niche, right? It's a very large niche, so to speak. So, tell me a little bit about the studio and the startups and kind of stage size, like what y'all do.
Yeah, so, we really are early stage. But I think really before Venture for Climate Tech, most of the other kind of programs and models really were focused on later early stage, and mostly Series A, maybe Series B, kind of helping folks go from prototype to mass production and commercialization. We do actually have a sister program that does that and specifically focuses on hardware and manufacturing startups. But our venture studio, and the reason why we created kind of this unique model, is really de-risking the earliest stages of climate technologies. And so that looks like actually 3 phases, with the first being really more of a traditional venture studio model where we're actually actually, creating a space for our founders and these innovators to really think about, what is product market fit, customer discovery, sort of what's their overarching business model, but then also helping them build strong founding teams, which I think has been overlooked in this space. At least our thesis was, many of the founders entering this space would have a science PhD background. And that's still true to a certain extent. I think if you talk to other, VCs in the space, they see that as well. And it's great that they understand the science or, really understand, I think, the research behind the solution, but many of them don't understand what it means to scale, right, a technology and actually build a revenue generating business. And so what we did was create basically an entrepreneur and expert in residence program that allows our founders to find a CTO or a director of sales or someone who can really help them lead on the business front, while they oftentimes are the experts on the science and the actual technology. And then we also provide, up to 125K and funding, and that's really based off of milestones that we require each of our founders to hit. They're not necessarily, guaranteed to make it to the end. We do cut founders if they're not reaching those milestones, which again is why we created this unique model. We just felt like that was needed, and particularly in climate, because we know that the odds are already stacked against them in this space. And in addition to that, they really do need to understand what it takes to be strong founders in this space, really understand the investor readiness piece. That's really a lot of what I lead on as well, making sure that they have a full breadth of knowledge around what are the investment opportunities they can go after. So of course that's angel and VC, but then we also talk about, grants and impact investments, and I think debt and project finance for later down the line. So really helping them understand what are the tools to their success. And so, that's the overview of how we think about our model. In terms of the founders and technologies themselves, they tend to be focused on some of the more, I keep saying capital intensive, but really what I'm getting at is, having an application for, I think, an urban built environment like New York. And so many of them are coming from the space of energy, coming from, what we do have one water company, though that, that's not necessarily our norm. We also have a few different, built environment infrastructure companies. I think I might have mentioned this during my last talk when we met in Atlanta, but, Volt Post in our cohort is retrofitting lampposts and really thinking about how do you use existing infrastructure within cities to create opportunities for electric vehicle charging. That's an overview of some of the companies coming out of our cohort, and the requirement is that they are cutting GHG emissions. So we actually help them create a very solid case around why they're climate focused, what their impact will be. They again also have to have an application for a place like New York. We do accept global founders and ideas, and so we help fine tune the thinking around that by making sure it's specific to being able to scale here in a place like New York.
Yeah. How do you, there's days I think, everybody's gone capital light and app economy and MVP, in 90 days. And that's all great in the software world. The hardware world, the material science world, it's a little bit different. You look at technical risk and market risk. The technical risk of most softwares is fairly low. You start getting into AI, it gets a little bit higher, but generally speaking, it's a little bit lower if it's like a workflow tool. It's interesting because I've done about half a dozen university spinouts, and I have to talk to the professor and basically say, like, do you want to be rich or do you want to be king? Because, I'm like, just be a founder. No one can ever take that founder title away from you, the co-founder title. But there's a really good chance someone's going to take that CEO title away from you because it's just different, right? The cadence and working with investors and being investor ready is a totally different thing. And how you execute on milestones is very different. And we've just found that there's very few research professors that make that shift into executing on timelines and goals.
Yeah, fair. I do think to a certain extent we were proven wrong, and that we thought more of our founders would be PhDs. We do have a couple and obviously some scientists, but others are just folks who are really interested in the space, have a vision, I think have a knack and a gift for inspiring people and getting them, excited about a solution. There were a couple founders, we have a board, and our board includes folks who've been in this space for a really long time. And we were like, oh, we don't know if they'll make it through, just given where they're at, but also their background. And they just have that X factor, that you can't really account for sometimes. And so that meant that, they maybe weren't a technical founder or a PhD, but there was something about them and their solution and the way they brought it forward that really stuck out to us. I should also say that we don't only focus on hardware, and I think that's really important for early stage climate. We do have a software solution. I think software is something that we want to continue to focus on even more as we grow, because I think the reality is that there's, to your point, a lot of applications to better understanding not only the data in this space, but also data that can inform deployment and expedite deployment of some of the, more capital intensive technologies in the space. And I think, you and I have probably, or I think we mentioned this when we were both again in Atlanta, but I know I've talked about this a lot. I think there are software solutions that are going to help us actually move the conversation forward around how to de-risk, some of the hardware or material science technologies and solutions that are out there.
Yeah, it's interesting. My first experience when I was still working at Georgia Tech, I ran a PhD like commercialization class, and I got exposed to all these like biology PhDs and chemistry, and I quickly figured out they all just show up with 2 laptops. They're actually, I thought a chemistry PhD, they're sitting in the lab doing, they don't actually do much of that anymore. They're all like they've all become like data scientists, and it's pretty fascinating how they really leverage a lot of software to really accelerate things that they would have normally been looking through a microscope or pouring chemicals in a lab somewhere. They're simulating on computers, on laptops all day long. So it's definitely changed. We're Second Muse. This is like a thread, right? The climate tech is like one leg of what y'all do. What else do y'all do?
Yeah, well, I mean, we have a pretty large kind of climate circular economy portfolio. So I guess for those who don't know about Second Muse, we're a global innovation and impact firm. We've been around for about 10 plus years, and really our goal is focused on creating future economies that are more regenerative and sustainable and inclusive. And so what that looks like is launching innovation programming across the globe. So I think innovation programming, now is a bit more common, but when our C-suite really started, it wasn't necessarily as common as it is now. And the way that we define it is really, challenges, so open innovation challenges, venture studios, incubators, accelerators. I think really any sort of catalyst for supporting entrepreneurs and getting to market. Some examples have included running NASA Space Apps Challenge, which we've been doing for 10 plus years. There's actually a very interesting application for just some of the science coming from the space conversation within climate. And so we're even exploring what does that look like for the future of our climate portfolio. One of the founders in our existing cohort is actually thinking through essentially a less carbon intensive, more environmentally friendly alternative to jet fuel. It's a moonshot solution. The idea is that anyone would be able to travel anywhere within the world within, 3 hours. And so I think, those are the types of solutions that are interesting and exciting to think about in the space at the intersection of climate and some of the work that NASA's doing. We also run, for example, Get Cities, which is, for those who don't know, comes out of Melinda Gates' Pivotal Ventures. It's a nationwide program focused on getting more women into technology. We have a network based out of Singapore called the Incubation Network, which we run in partnership with Circulate Capital, and help deploy close to, I believe, $106 million focused on technologies that are thinking through solutions to waste, and which is a huge problem, right, in that area. and funding projects, technologies, ideas that are solving that specific problem and really thinking through circular economy. And then we run, without going on and on, we run a bunch of sort of place-based incubators and accelerators that are funded by various foundations and families, and really look at how do you support sort of local innovation. And how do you do that from a standpoint of looking at the resources and tools, but also the funding, the financial mechanisms that are needed to help those companies after they leave a program or, any sort of studio that's helping them create an idea and scale it and bring it to market. So that's the overview of Second Muse as sort of this, private entity. We also have a foundation. And so we do work via our foundation in support of that inclusive piece that I mentioned earlier, and really thinking about how do we create pathways for all communities to be a part of the innovation ecosystem. And then the last part of our work is our capital arm, where we run a process at the heart of it called Future Economy Lab. And really the goal there is to explore alongside an ecosystem the gaps that are existing, and then design, actually fundraise for and manage financial mechanisms that are helping to fill that gap. So it's kind of the full overview. We do a lot. It's really exciting to try to keep up with it all.
That's very cool. If anyone on the line has questions, go ahead and put them in the Q&A box. Would love to get questions from all of y'all. How do you think, just like you spent time in all these other countries, and Singapore is one that I thought was fascinating because Singapore lives in a world of scarcity, right? They don't actually have any resources. Mm-hmm. And so they've had to do things like invent massive scaling, desalination processes. And it feels like a lot of other countries just have a much longer view. When we say, we want to go do something, we're thinking 3 to 5 years, and they're working on things that are 10 years and 15 years, and they're funded that way. It's kind of like, it's high risk. It's a big idea. Big ideas don't get executed in 3 years. It just kind of takes time. And it feels like a lot of the European and Asian capital is just a lot more patient than American capital. We have one Japanese LP, and when I was in Tokyo and they were interviewing me, they said, what's my succession plan? Are your kids going to be in the business? What's your 50-year plan? I was like, 50 years? 50 years, right? What are you talking about? Yeah, but it's a different mindset. Do you ever feel like some of the capital, especially when it comes to doing big things around clean tech, like a lot of the U.S. capital is just not patient enough about those things?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I think my biased opinion is yes. Yes, we're not patient here, but I think it's also backed by data, and I won't pretend to know all of it. We're actually launching a process, the same process I mentioned earlier, Future Economy Lab, to explore sort of what's needed in the earliest stages of financing for climate founders. That being said, Susan Sue, for those who aren't familiar, she's a good friend, and she was at Sound Ventures, and I think probably about a year ago now, just realized she wanted to do more in the climate space, and probably spent the last 8 months, whether it was on Clubhouse, writing her own newsletter, leading Terra.do's Climate Tech for VCs, which I highly recommend if you're, a VC and you're kind of curious about what's going on in the climate tech space. She wrote an article that actually looked at where the biggest investments were coming from for clean tech or climate tech. And I think to your point, KP, it wasn't the US, it was primarily sort of the Middle Eastern, North Africa region, and also Asia, different parts of Asia. And so I think that is kind of at the heart of the question here. Like as we, as a country in the US really think about climate tech and energy transition, what does that mean for how we finance it or don't, right, over the next, let's say, 5 to 10 years. And I think the pessimistic view is, we won't do it, right, that we won't have kind of the right ways of thinking about it, or we don't have the the frameworks that they do in terms of timeline to actually be able to invest in that way. But I think the optimist in me feels like this is actually a tipping point in a really interesting time to see what we can do in the space. And I say that because, again, speaking to the Department of Energy more recently and kind of hearing some of their goals and what they're looking at, even on the manufacturing side, when we think about like revitalizing some of our manufacturing sector. I know that that's been a goal for various cities over the past 5 to 10 years, but I think there's actual not only support, but incentives to really start doing so. I mean, does that mean we're going to have a booming manufacturing sector in the next 2 years? No, but I think that it does mean that there's an opportunity to really think about how do we create a more attractive environment for technologies to actually be able to kind of get to that place where, you do see more VCs vying for the actual investment opportunity, let's say at the Series A, Series B level. And, we do have a company, I'm sure some folks in the audience are familiar with them, Opus 12. They just rebranded as 12. They closed their Series A at, I believe it was $57 million. And the reality is that many of these technologies that have any sort of hardware component need lab space. They need a space where they can kind of go and iterate, right? Like it's not a product that's one and done. The idea is that you try it, it works, you pilot it, and then you continue to improve it over time. And I think that's going to be key as we think about what it means to invest in these technologies, because a part of it is, yes, they need more investment from, maybe traditional VC or other financial mechanisms. But then there's all of these, I think, other touch points that actually will allow them to succeed that have to be talked about in the process. And so we've been thinking a lot about that. I think if you think about spaces like the new lab based out of Brooklyn, that's what they're providing these companies, essentially a space to actually iterate and to kind of have the expertise they need on the ground and to have that, I think, that magic that happens when you have a founder and an engineer and a scientist, all coming back to essentially iterate continuously on the product.
That's right. No, I agree with you. Like when I was running Georgia Tech's incubator, we had lab space with hoods and all that. And you started to realize like, this isn't like everybody work from home and like you all have to kind of be in the room. I got a question here. It says, how important is non-dilutive grant funding for your startups? Is it something that you generally recommend pursuing, or do you think it's a waste of time?
Yeah, definitely not a waste of time. I think it can feel like that as a founder if you're not using the right resources to actually pursue that funding. And I say that to say that many founders, and not just founders, like I've worked with corporate teams who start new teams in the US or in a city in the US, and they don't understand anything about kind of the processes, whether it's around grants or larger procurement. And they'll maybe even spend years going after the same opportunities and not really understanding why they're not actually securing those opportunities. And, I remember leading, it was a free session that we did for a number of founders that we couldn't accept into the program in our first year. And it was essentially like, how do you use the same language to show that you are in alignment, right, with the opportunity that's being presented? And I think, again, I don't think it's just founders. I think it's anyone, honestly, in a technical space. It's so easy to get caught up in your solution. And before you know it, you're pitching like the intricacies of a product or a technology, and you're not paying attention to your audience. And again, I've seen this happen in real time, even with Fortune 500 companies, pitching huge projects to an administration. They're just so siloed into their work. They're not thinking about their audience. And so all of that to say that it's definitely not a waste of time, but you have to understand what's needed to actually secure those opportunities, which oftentimes means the same language they're using. I get that, you might want to talk about your technology or your solution in a certain way, but if that doesn't actually align with, or it doesn't resonate with what the person on the other side of the application is reading, it won't work, right? And so I think, what we've done with our founders, but also I think what some of our founders have just had to learn the hard way, even before working with us, is that, they have to essentially align it with the goals of whoever they're applying with, right? And so using that language, again, even if it doesn't resonate for how you talk about your technology, it doesn't matter. You're trying to secure that $750,000 grant or whatever it is that you need to continue to run your business. But, actually the truth of the matter is that many technologies in this space historically have benefited greatly from government grants and government funding, and there's a huge track record. And so I think, that's why I think it's so easy to say, hey, well, VC needs to do more, and, debt needs to be a better vehicle for these founders, or impact investing. Now I feel like impact VC is a common phrase, so it's all just starting to merge at this point. But all of that to say that, I think it has to be all of those things. And as a founder, you have to really think about, what's going to help you scale successfully. And so that's why we even talk to our founders about, making sure you're ready for VC. I don't know if I'm sure folks in the audience are familiar with Taj Eldridge, but, he was at Lacey for a really long time and ran climate investments for their incubator. And he was speaking with our founders recently and said, people like to celebrate themselves for getting VC funding. He's like, you need to celebrate yourself for, getting that customer, right? And securing that pilot project, because once you have VC funding, that's just the start of everything. You're now expected to return that capital to your investors. And I think oftentimes, or I'll speak just from my experience, even over the past several months, $17 billion have been invested into climate funds in just 2021 alone, which is incredible and super exciting. And that means that, our founders who are pre-seed and seed are getting outreach from private equity firms and from, really later stage investors that are interested in this space, because it is kind of this exciting space to be in, and everyone's interested in what's happening. And again, I don't think that's a bad thing, but I think we have to be cognizant of, understanding or making sure that founders and investors alike really understand the risk and the space and what they're investing in. But then I think on the founder side, what they're essentially agreeing to, right, and taking this capital. And so we hosted a session with Carta, actually, I think 2 weeks ago, focused on climate investment trends and technologies. And, many investors were talking about this idea of really needing more opportunity for even educating themselves on the technologies and the science, because it can be very sciencey, and it's not necessarily always familiar. So.
No, I think it's interesting that the grants. I used to sit on NSF grant review, and I was a PI for a while, and I stopped. I think what I tell people is it's like something that's very different to how you like to operate is very hard. For me, grants were very hard. Put me in front of investors and let me pitch.
Yeah.
And clearly communicate the value prop. Like, that's my world. Spending days locked up and putting documents together, like, that is not my world.
Yeah.
But there's people that are really, really good at that you can't, to the point, the people you put on stage and they start looking at their shoes and talking about the engineering solution.
Right.
They don't do well with the VCs, but they probably do great with writing grants. And I think it's important. It's like, we have a portfolio company called Icon. They do 3D printed houses. They've gotten a ton of grant money.
Right.
They got grant money to help build systems to build homes on Mars. Right. It's like, what VC, go pitch that to any VC. I'm going to build homes on Mars. Give me $20 million. And the answer is no. Not in the world of grant money, right? Like, what other innovations will come from this that are going to be important? So, no, I think I think it's just different. But I tell founders all the time, like, the most non-dilutive money, the earlier, the better. And in my world, the most non-dilutive money is customers. Get customers first. But I think I tweeted something about, like, I think we're all going to work for Tiger Global here in the next 2 years, because they just seem to be throwing money around, and I think they're all going to own us. Between them and SoftBank, we'll all work for them. So.
That sounds right. Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's, like you said, knowing what you're good at, right? And I think that's why our model, again, was how do we help our founders identify what they're good at and then what their gaps are, and then help them hire a team that, we literally were just talking to one of our founders, like, you need someone technical. Like, it's just, it's great that you're building this and we're excited about what you're doing, but you need someone who really understands the tech side of things. And so I think as a founder, just being honest and not trying to do everything. I was still always in shock of people who were like, been applying to this thing for 5 years. I'm like, well, why would you keep applying by yourself if you're not, if you're not getting it? At some point, you have to ask for help, right? Or at least move on and try something else. Don't keep beating a dead horse, right?
Yeah, our CTO Matt and I, we had this conversation. Just and I don't know, we've been kind of technical founders, so we feel very disrespected when a founder's like, well, I'm just going to offshore the code. I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, you have to do it. Like, what are you doing? You can't do that. I'm going to outsource sales. Like, it's one of those things that we get super highly offended. But I do think when you're solving real problems, like you have to have someone that's worrying about it every day and focused on the technical challenges, because they are real and they have to be worried about it all the time.
Right.
Yeah. What do you see in terms of, like, when you're talking to your companies, there's areas where I see these patterns emerge, like energy management, and we get 10 of those inbounds a week kind of thing, right? And it's all over the place. It's just all over the place. And I think we were talking about HVAC systems and it appears that everybody's trying to solve all these big problems. They're very narrow problems, but they're big problems. And that they should all be like playing well together and like working together, right? Like, hey, I'm solving this HVAC problem and I'm over here solving this solar panel problem. And it's like, why aren't you two talking? Do you find like these intersections of collaboration within your venture studio and these founders? And how's it been like getting them to try to play ball with each other?
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, we 100% have seen this like appetite for collaboration. I do think a part of it is that's how we've created an environment where that's kind of expected. So in thinking about our curriculum, we didn't want it to just sort of be like here's a curriculum for every company, particularly because they're so different, right? I mean, I mentioned some of the companies earlier, but none of them are really building the same thing. And so we have weekly differentiated coaching with them, but then also kind of overarching themes that we make sure that we cover with all of them through shared curriculum. But many of them are collaborating and many of them are seeing the value in kind of having these conversations. I mean, everything from, well, your tagline is super technical. It's not inspiring anyone. It might tell you, who you are and what you do, but if your goal is to get a customer, right? How is that landing? It's been interesting, but also amazing to see our founders giving each other that feedback and kind of helping them get out of their specific space. And I think that's a challenge, but also an opportunity with climate, is that because there's such a big variety of solutions to be built and deployed and thought through. We don't really have a solution. None of our solutions are really overlapping. And we were cognizant of that. We didn't want, to your point, like 3 energy management teams. And, we did see several. And then we kind of looked at the market and said, well, this company's already at their Series A. We don't see anything that's differentiated around how you're either approaching the market or thinking through your model. And so, not to say you won't be successful, but we're kind of looking for the last 20% of climate technologies. And we said that going into this, that many climate technologies have been proven over the past couple of decades, right? They've been tested. We know what they look like. We actually just need tools to expedite their deployment. But we were really looking for like that last 20% that we felt, hasn't necessarily been created, but can have a really large impact on the environment. So all that to say that I think our creation of that portfolio reflects that. And so it allows for the founders to really learn from each other. And they share resources, whether it's previous grant applications that they've written for themselves. And they've said, hey, we didn't win this one, but we won this one. Here's where we thought here's what we thought accounted for that. And sharing that with the other founders. I think that's the those are the type of nuggets that are really important. I think hearing from your peer, but also just the various feedback of, hey, actually that doesn't resonate. I used to work, because we have climate scientists, they can tell our other founders and say, I used to work in this space and, that's not going to fly, or I think you should be approaching it differently. And so we do see a lot of that collaboration and sort of real-time feedback happening. And the last thing I'll say on that too is that, our software company is essentially helping the everyday person invest in large infrastructure, not necessarily large, but, projects, local projects in their communities through project finance. So basically being a platform like Acorns that allows the everyday person to own assets in a local project, a local energy project. And, one of the reasons we were drawn to their model is because we understood that it could help with financing for the rest of our, the rest of our companies in our cohort. And so I think even in that business model, he gets to talk to his customers, right, through his cohort every day and say, well, what would make you feel comfortable listing a future project on a platform like mine? So we do see a lot of that. I do feel like there needs to be more of that just across the space outside of kind of each portfolio. But, I actually have been talking to a lot of the leading climate incubators and accelerators across the country. And we're starting to have some really interesting conversations around how can we essentially combine solutions and sectors and think about them from pain points and hurdles and solutions to working with industry.
How do you think industry, we've been having these talks all day, and we have a lot of engineering firms and construction companies and real estate developers. And I think a lot of them pattern in, they're very risk averse. Like, I'm not going to specify this because I don't know enough about it. And I'll specify this other thing that maybe isn't that great, but I've specified it for 20 buildings, so I'm going to keep specifying it. How have you seen a difference around that, whether it's the engineering firms or construction companies, subcontractors, developers? Do you see, I know you're kind of very New York focused, but have you seen like any differences around where they are, like in terms of geographically? Like, does an Atlanta, engineering firm look different than a Portland? I met with these folks that are like Portland, LA, and San Francisco. And I had the most fantastic conversation with them because they were just nodding their head yes to everything I was talking about. They're like, yes, net zero buildings. Like, absolutely, Whereas sometimes I have East Coast conversations about a net zero building. They're like, well, is that really realistic? Is that, at what cost, right? Do you see, like, within this service network of engineers and contractors, like, different, like, or are they all changing? Are they all kind of saying, no, we need to do better?
Yeah, that's a great question. I will say, as you mentioned, a lot of our work is focused on New York. And so, even with the pandemic, it's Climate Week in New York. So I've actually been meeting folks in person, which has been nice. And, I think that from my experience, thinking about New York and LA, for example, we had a partner in LA that was doing similar work to ours. So we created a national partnership doing some of this work. I think a lot of it is informed by the appetite of that specific market. And so I think, in New York, it's been interesting because I think for a long time, to your point, there wasn't really an interest or even an acknowledgement with most of the people you spoke with. I think now, given local law 96 and 97, there is an actual interest, even if the interest is only driven by a mandate, right? And better understanding what solutions are taking place. Geographically, I don't know that I can speak to very distinct differences, but I have noticed that, if I meet an innovation team in any of those types of companies, or someone who's leading on innovation or just even intrigued by it, they can oftentimes drive multiple regions to start thinking about it. And, I'm not someone who approaches it from hey, you have a mandate to meet, or even, this is a good thing to do. To me, it's about the cost savings and what's going to be most interesting to you. And so even whether it's with founders, whether it's me having conversations more broadly about why a mandate, yes, is a requirement, but also an opportunity. I think it's really the framing that can help create some sort of pathway to actually thinking with these firms around what it looks like to get involved. And then I think the reality too is sometimes acknowledging that, change and innovation is going to happen whether or not you're ready for it, right? And that you can kind of be a part of what that looks like, or you can be on the receiving end of what I'm seeing even more of, and just something to continue to think about is like this accountability measurement. There are many, we were just talking about software solutions that can get to market faster. There are many folks who are thinking about how can they utilize this data aggregation to actually hold industry players accountable, right? Or even help policymakers and regulators think about that. And so I think that whether I'm looking at New York or other spaces, it's kind of figuring out where the market is, and then sort of what aligns with what they're focused on and how they're thinking about their company.
Yeah, that lines up. We actually have a research group, and we do a lot of primary research, and we talk to, I don't know, it was like 20 or 30 CEOs of real estate development firms and ask them about sustainability and like try to get some raw feedback from them. They're like, look, as a human, I agree the planet is on fire. However, my investors aren't going to be that excited about me trying to take on this thing called climate change. They want me to send them money. It's like, what's my NOI? Yeah. So I have to accomplish both. Like I can't, and I do feel like the startups we're seeing are speaking that language better. Mm-hmm. They speak a lot better on the financial aspect of this isn't just about doing good. It's about, you can probably make some more money, so. Well, yeah. Very cool. We're almost out of time. Is there anything that I didn't ask you about? Is there anything that you want to? We're a big fan of shamelessly plugging things, so
I'll do a shameless plug.
I'm highly encouraging of it. So
amazing. Well, I just wanted to add to your point around kind of what's the opportunity and what you just mentioned. I think what I saw was in working with startups and then also working with property owners in a place like New York, there was an interesting thing or an interesting customer acquisition play and thus opportunity for generating revenue that I think oftentimes gets overlooked in some of these conversations that, many solutions are also looking to create revenue. And I think there are shared revenue models that we are only just starting to scratch the surface on. And I saw that in the deployment of things like e-scooters, right? And what it meant to actually partner with a solution like that to drive business, to drive foot traffic, right, to certain areas throughout a city. And so, I won't get super, I won't go on a rant about that, but I think that there's an opportunity. And again, I think the DOE is starting to think about this stuff, which is exciting, to really think about customers and community and what that means for revenue generation as we're actually trying to change behavior and incentives to drive solutions for climate. My shameless plug, we did our big summit last week, so I feel like that would have been the big one. But, we are wrapping up our cohort, which means we'll be starting recruitment. And so Venture for Climate Tech, again, really aims to be the earliest stage of de-risking climate technology. So if you're a founder, if you know other founders, if you know potential founders, because we're so early that have a neat idea or solution and kind of need that initial seed money to get off the ground and resources and tools, we'd love to hear from you or from a founder building something in this space. And again, the requirement is really that they cut GHG emissions and that they also are have an application for an urban environment in a place like New York.
Very cool. I don't know if Ian's going to join us back. He might be done for the day. But oh, there he goes.
Yeah, that was great. No, thank you both so much for joining. That was an incredible keynote, very insightful. If anybody does want to get in touch with Chante directly, feel free to reach out to me. I'll be sending out a recap email for the event. It was a great day, a great way to finish it as well. So it's just day one. We've got day two tomorrow with a lot more great, exciting content, some incredible discussion. So thank you again, Chante, for joining us. Thanks, KP, for leading the conversation. And we will see you all tomorrow.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Everyone.
Take care, guys.